The nurses hoisted Phoebus from his cot, holding him up by the armpits as they flipped him around to toss him into his wheelchair. Ugly bruises were already blooming on his salt-white skin from the leathery straps of his cot. His chapped lips bled, stinging his tongue with copper as his jaw lilted open and he sunk against the chair, body like a corpse. His naked feet sat crumpled on the floor, tiles white as he, while his arms dangled like dolls over the wheels. The world was a muddled blur from the cocktail they'd shot him with. The overhead fluorescence was like heavenly light in the windowless cell. The open door behind him, the pearly gates, and the nurses his angels. But they weren't gentle angels. One nurse threw Phoebus's feet into the stirrups, while the other set his arms firmly in place, both strapping him down with more belts and locks, pulling flush against the chair. One nurse threw Phoebus's feet into the stirrups, while the other set his arms firmly in place, both strapping him down with more belts and locks, pulling flush against the chair. He blinked against the hum of the drugs, head lilting forward as spittle and blood fell from his lips to grey uniform shirt over his skinny frame. He closed his mouth and swallowed as the nurses finished with his arms and legs, and pushed his head back up with a smack. The world buzzed as the nurses fastened his torso and chest in place with 3 hard pulls that would have concaved his stomach if he weren't so slim. They tightened the strap on his throat and forehead last, making the pressure just uncomfortable enough to keep him awake, but wishing he weren't. Must be time to see the doctor if they left my mouth free, he thought, as one nurse spun the chair and pushed him through the doors to navigate the sterile white halls of the underground facility. Door after door, hall after hall, left, right, straight, it was all the same. Never down until they reached the elevator, and never up at all. Gone was the waking world and the sun. But the keys were new. The nurse beside him had a ring of keys, her face coming in and out of focus like everything else, sharp and angular one minute and a nebula the next. She was harsh, sharp, unreadable, but she could be the doctor's twin. He looked forward and groaned at the flare and flash of light. White splotches bloomed and died over his eyes, smeared with halos of color that made the boring world unbearably bright, a blur of arching color and gasoline. The keys chimed with each heavy step, singing beside the high whine of the wheels, churning together as Phoebus's eyes fell. When he next opened them, it was another hallway, the one to the elevator. They rolled into his head, banishing the milky blur the world had become before drifting back as his reflection greeted him in the closing chrome doors. A skeleton looked back. He'd been the king of an empire he'd forged from his youth, a man of brilliance, of fame, of wealth and beauty, a man who'd had any woman he wanted, a man who'd been plastered across the magazines for his unique appearance and style among the youthful rich. Bone-white skin, crystal eyes, silver blonde hair, and on a black man. There was something about it that had drawn everyone's eye. He was the luck of the draw, beautiful for his strangeness, something odd, something daring, something unique, something new. Black, brown, copper, they weren't exotic enough. They weren't what wowed the people anymore, but he was. He was alien. He was marvelous. He was what the decadent rich and listless, gluttonous masses wanted to see to distract them from self-made, worthless lives they couldn't stand to look at for longer than was necessary. He was their beautiful idol. They were his mindless cattle. But now the muscle was gone from laying strapped to a bed. Now the hair was shaved short after being matted for too long. Now the manicured nails were scabbed from being cut too far back. Now a gape lip sat where the smirk should have been. Now the grey uniform replaced his pinstripe suit. The doors opened as he licked his lips, smearing the blood across his hairless chin. His eyes relaxed, drinking in the dark wood and muted tones set amongst the dim light from electric sconces. Windowless walls towered into a vaulted ceiling covered in frescoes of different ancient cultures. Drapes hung where windows should have been. A red oak desk sat near one wall as books watched him from shelves all round. The nurse set Phoebus with his back to the elevator, leaving him to look at a painting hung above a table with books and papers strewn over a map. The blur came and went with the ringing in his ears as he squinted his lulling eyes, heart racing, thudding slowly in his chest as he fought to breathe deeply. Within the frame, twin wolves leapt over a field of warriors and dead, feasted upon by crows, their snarling maws open to swallow the sun and moon. The elevator shut with a dull thud, bleeding into the pop and whine of the intercom in the four corners. A tear traced his cheek, and he looked between the glowering eyes of the wolves, each watching him hungrily. "You should blink," he thought. "Go ahead. Blink. It's been a while." He squeezed his eyes shut, and the extra tears fell. "At least she won't think I'm breaking." "Phoebus." The doctor's voice came clear and cheerful from the speakers as if she were right beside him. "How are we doing today?" He smirked as best he could and slurred. "No cocktails kicking my ass, Doc. Might want to go easier. I won't be able to answer your questions." "Duly noted." "So what have you got for me this time?" He swallowed and licked his lips, eyes straining to stare up at the painting. The wolves stared back, eyes like fire. "Childhood trauma? How about my abandonment issues?" He breathed, his pulse slow as he gulped at the thin air. "Or maybe my dreams? That was actually interesting." "Yes, your dreams. Have there been any more since your time in my care?" He choked a laugh, sneering before he sprayed spit onto the painting, eyes shooting up to the camera under the speaker to his right as the bile rolled down the black wolf's pelts. "I haven't dreamed one thing since I've been shackled to this particular circle of hell, you whore." "Not even any recurring dreams?" "No," he growled between his teeth. "What about the Black Sea where you fought the sea serpent?" He panted through a laugh, sinking against the cushioned wheelchair. "It wasn't a sea serpent, and it wasn't the sea. I told you." The words came easier. "I don't know where it was. Everything was black and quiet, and the monster was... well, it was like the thing was the blackness." His eyes shot like daggers to the wall, and then down at the puncture in his arm. "I'm awful chatty. What did you give me?" "Something to keep you calm." "Truth serum's illegal, Doc." He smirked up at the camera. "Nothing's illegal while I'm sitting, Phoebus." Her voice was light, smiling on the air before she continued. "And there's a few other things to help you remember." "I told you, I haven't dreamed anything." "You don't remember your dreams? Few do, especially of this kind." The lights dimmed until the room was nearly oblivion. "Now, I want you to think back." A light flashed on behind him, casting the painting with his shadow and burning the backs of his eyes. "What's the last dream you remember?" The light flicked off, replaced with an inaudible hum that shook his chest. It flashed again. He shut his eyes, heart racing back to normal as he gripped the arms of the chair, his head swimming in the burst of light. "Phoebus, are you still there?" "I'm not dead yet," he growled. "Well, that's good. I'd hate to have to find you all over again." "What?" he thought. "What's the last dream you remember? The serpent? The throne room? The wall?" The lights flicked off as the rumble buried into him, scratching at the back of his skull. Everything primal screamed to kick and fight and curse and kill as he pulled against the restraints. His heart raced, pulse pounding in his ears alongside the grind of his teeth. He pulled. "Phoebus!" The light flashed. He pulled. "Phoebus!" the doctor said louder. The light flicked off. He twisted in his chair, eyes open as he snarled. The light flashed onto the wolves' hungry faces. "What's the last dream you remember?" Her voice came before the light flicked off, and the rumble jumped into him. "What was it?" He arched his back against the strap at his chest and gut, atrophied muscles threatening to break under the strain. The light flashed. His eyes widened over a frozen snarl as the painting glared at him. Not two wolves. A dragon. A horned serpent with black scales and bottomless white eyes tilted its head up at him through the frame. The paint moved in the picture as it slithered above the frozen carnage and crept nearer, its barbed tail swaying as it dove for the corpses. Its muscular legs caught and launched from the ground, flying at the frame. Phoebus leapt back in his seat, snarling incoherent nonsense as heat swallowed his face and filled his hands. He screamed at it as claws hooked over the golden frame, as its long crocodilian maw inched off the paint into the air of the waking world. It snorted a cold breath in his face as he spat at it. It opened its mouth. The light flashed from behind and caught the rim of a speaker in its throat. "Phoebus," the doctor's voice came from the dragon's throat. "What's the last dream you remember?" The light flicked off. "The serpent," he panted, wide eyes staring at the place the dragon had been. The light came and the dragon was gone, the leaping wolves back in their place with his spit still rolling down the paint. "Good. What was the serpent doing again?" "You already know this," he shouted, adrenaline burning his veins, eyes still on the painting like it might come alive at any moment. "Indulge me." He sighed through his teeth and barked the words.
"I was wrapped in something hot and wet and struggling to get out. I got out."
He pulled against his restraints. "Please don't do that, Phoebus. Keep calm."
"I flopped out of something, carved my way out of the dragon. I knew it knew I was there even though I'd never seen it before, but I had to wait for the others. I had to, just to spite it."
He snarled a smile, its cries ringing in his ears, like the sound his high school bully made when he told him to never mess with him again. "Why?"
"It didn't want us. It only wanted itself, and we were in the way."
He scowled and jerked reflexively against the restraints.
"It would eat us, smother us, and put us right back into the prison I'd just broken out of."
"But you were inside the serpent?"
"Then," he continued, "it saw me. It hated me. I was everything it wasn't. I was better."
"Better?"
"And it knew it."
Spittle flew on his words, heart pounding in his temples as vague memories splashed behind his eyes of a roiling landscape of black serpents. "Better in what way?" Her voice smirked.
"All it did was consume and make just so it could destroy. But I made so my creations could stand atop my hands as the rightful foundation."
"But nothing could stand without you then."
"What does it matter if I'd never leave it?"
he panted, struggling against the restraints, growling, body on fire as his muscles bulged. The light flicked on and off behind him every few seconds, the rumble alternating with it. Dark and rumble, light and silence, as the doctor spoke. "So what did you do?"
"I fought it. I won,"
he panted, settling into the chair, glowering at the painting as the wolves smiled down at him, teeth in want of blood. "Ah, but last time you said you fought with 2 others in your dream, a man and a woman. Has that changed? He blinked, puzzling through his thoughts for the dream.
No. No, I fought on my own first, then with the others as they came out.
It flared, the dragon rearing and hungry, mouth open and claws yawning as it roared and cursed him. He was tiny under it, a single shining star in the dark, but when he leapt, he flew, and his first hit filled the silence with thunder. The light flashed, and the wolves stared at him. In the trembling dark, the dragon reeled and cursed him in an alien tongue. It vomited fire on its screams, but Phoebus didn't move. The blue and white flame moved over him like water. He reached out and took one of the burning tongues, ripped it free like an iron bar. He leapt. The light flashed, and the wolf's teeth seemed to sink deeper into the bleeding sun and moon. But in the dark, he brought down the flame like an axe onto the serpent's massive crocodile skull. Its mouth shut as it rammed into its own writhing mass below. He looked over his shoulder, shining white as the flames of the serpent's mouth, and saw a warm light in the shape of a man fall from the wound in the dragon's side. Phoebus snarled and yelled. He ran before the serpent could see the man, grabbed one of its horns and jumped, jerking its head back and arching it through the black as his light grew. It yelped around a plume of flame, body wriggling like a worm. Its skull thudded to the roiling floor. He turned.
"Where is she?"
The light flashed on the glowering wolves, and the dream was gone.
Wait, there's something different.
What is it? The doctor asked.
I was glowing. No, I was made of... I was light. And then another man, he came after me from the dragon.
Was he the same as you?
No.
The light flicked off, and the man stood before him in the dark, naked and glowing, as brilliant as the sunrise. Body sculpted of molten iron and gold, shining, warm like spring and summer sunset, sweet perfumes and cool wind tussling his thick curls. The light flashed and banished him.
No, I was made of white light. He was beautiful. Made of... like molten metal.
Interesting. Did he have your face?
No.
Have you ever seen him before?
No. Maybe. He's familiar, but I don't know him.
Does he help you fight?
I don't know.
What about the other?
The dream ends there, Doc. It's not like I can lie.
Phoebus pulled his right arm against the restraints, a fresh bead of blood welling at the injection site. So then you were wrong. In our first session I asked you a question. Do you remember? He scoffed.
Yes. I told you then you were crazy, and I haven't changed my mind.
Well, there's no call for insults, Phoebus, but I'll allow it, given your circumstances.
Kidnapped, drugged, imprisoned, and tortured.
He snapped up at the camera, and the light and rumble filled the room.
Yeah, I'd say you got plenty of reason to insult you, you cantankerous, festering boil of a parasitic quack.
She chuckled. It's always impressed me how you can be so sincerely insulting and yet not use a single expletive.
Oh, I know plenty. Like to hear a few?
I asked what your earliest memory was, and you said it was a dream. You told it to me, and it was that dream.
And then you asked me if I remembered the beginning of the world. Like I'm someone who buys into that reincarnation.
Not quite. I asked if you remembered when the world was young. So I'll ask you again. Do you remember?
He scoffed. Wheel me back to my cell and let me starve to death already. I'm done.
No, you're not. Her voice was calm but sharp, somehow making the air seem cold. Picture it, and tell me what you see. What do you imagine the beginning to be? The light flared for a long moment with the deep rumble, so loud it shook him in the chair, threatened to loosen the latches. Phoebus closed his eyes as the light grew, almost burning bright. "Picture it. What do you see?" Silence screamed in his ears as the rumble died. He opened his eyes on the pitch-black room, his panting breath steadying as flitting eyes made shapes in the dark. Something huge moved in front of his face like a whale swimming in black. "What do you see?" The doctor's voice came low as the shape moved and swam, the darkness coalescing. He reached out, unfettered by the straps of the chair, and hovered glowing fingers over the darkness. It glinted like ink, reflecting his light in misshapen grooves, pits, and lumps. He furrowed his brow and set his jaw, fingers burning brighter, hotter, as they closed the distance and touched the worming wall of black. It steamed under his burning fingers, twitching, pulling back like a startled beast. He sneered, turning his hand over, mouth contorting at the black-grey mucus sizzling to dust on his white skin, churning with rivers of white flame. He thrust his hand, the dark flesh sizzling and popping under his fiery skin, steam and smoke blowing around him and casting his braided locks back. Something rumbled from far away, and the wall clenched like a giant muscle, pushing him back to tumble over a similar floor. He pushed himself up from hands and knees and scowled, breath hot as he stood and spat, making the floor sputter and burn. Light swam on his skin, blistering the humid air and lighting the dark world. Close to him the floor was bleached of color in his white light. Then it grew grey and pink, then red, then purple and brown and black, a cavern of flesh and veins and refuse. He glowered at the wall, the floor, the darkness of the near-infinite world above, his fists balled, smoking as his eyes fell and he looked over his shoulder to the way he'd come. Hills and mountains rose and fell as vile things took root in the floor of her bow, and from between them the warm light he'd left behind. The only good thing, surrounded by hunger and loneliness, he thought, scowling as he looked back at the wall of flesh. He lifted a shining hand and traced the cool wall, grey meat undulating and veins like black lightning worming away from him. He wrinkled his nose, stomach churning as fire pooled in his gut, filling him. His lips peeled over crystal teeth as flaming eyes blazed like newborn stars. The only good thing, he thought, and it's imprisoned here. He pulled his arm back, balling up his fist as he yelled. The fire in his gut swam up his arm and pooled in his fist, glowing brighter than the rest of him as tense muscle hardened and released. His arm flew. His arm sunk up to the elbow with a screaming sear as steam and wind blew back into his face from the wound. He stared, glower replaced by a tentative smile that quickly overcame his face with a high laugh. The cave shook and rumbled, trembling against the heat of his light, white and gentle with excitement. But joy turned to pleasure, and he burned, the furnace in his gut filling him with white fire that ran through his veins and flesh until he was a blur of light, and the flesh around him blackened and sloughed away as ash. He drove his arm deeper, black blood spilling on him and catching to green flame in his light as he took the flesh in his other hand and pried it open. His snarling smile carved his face as the muscle and organ of the cave quivered and fought him, failing with each low, distant groan. He laughed over the searing flesh, the organs, the growls of the cave, grunting and groaning as he hungrily pulled and pried the flesh apart. His light burst and burned, the new walls squeezing and convulsing to push him back into the cave, even as they blackened under green flames. He barked a laugh around an insult and stepped forward when the flesh had burned away enough that it couldn't close on him anymore. 2 alien names flew past his lips as he looked over his shoulder, the warm campfire light brighter and closer as he shouted again.
"Come, hurry, to me!"
He pushed, carving and tearing the flesh as he went, screaming over his shoulder for them to follow between the hissing screams of the meat. He pushed and pushed until all the world was nothing but blood and rank flesh writhing around him in white and green flames before flaking away. His hand hit something solid. He stopped and struck it again, but nothing happened. The flesh around him seared and screamed in the white light and flames, blackening and shrinking away into an open chamber. Then the flames licked something else, something hard, something that didn't burn. He set his hand to it, but there was no smoke. He squinted, fingers raking the hard surface. "This isn't the end," he thought. "There's something else. Outside this hell, something else." The furnace in his gut raged, face contorting out of human shape, body thrumming and twisting with his own heat until he was a blistering corona. His arms and legs split and warped into living arches, his body danced with itself like rivers of atomized magma, and his voice came from all of him. The blackened cavern shook, the scabs and cooked meat blown away in the dry, hot gale thrust from his skin. He groaned, body peeling away and stitching itself back together, dying and healing and dying again. He touched the hard wall, and it steamed beneath his twitching, broken, fluid fingers. It screamed at him, hissing, whining as it dried and cracked and shrank away like a beaten dog. If he still had a face, he would have smiled, but laughter and screams rose from his fiery skin, dancing together into something else. He clawed the wall, rearing back and flinging himself against it like a whip, sapping every bead of moisture from it with each touch until it crumbled to dust and ash. He grabbed at the things beneath, plates, jostled loose as the skin burned away, and pried them apart until one finally tore free and tumbled into the black ether beyond. He twisted, flaming forms stilled like candle flame as he looked eyelessly through the broken hole in the wall of their prison. The whole world was darkness. Black and night roiled on itself, shifting in fat Stygian hills that looped and knotted together like lovers. The darkness only broken by tiny pinpricks of light. Each one twinkled and died faster than he could have blinked, as much as a dream, as a possibility. "There's nothing," he thought, then added aloud, "That's it? That's all there is?" His heat wavered, body cooling into something like a man, until he stood on his feet and looked over his shoulder. His sneer deflated, mouth slack as dim eyes dreaded the approach of the growing, warm light. His shoulders fell with his eyes, staring through the wall of flesh at nothing. He thought, should I tell him to go back? What good's freedom if it's into nothingness? What if it consumes us? What if the dark's worse than this? His fists balled at his side, fire flicking in his gut as he ground his jaw. And what if it is? Worse is better than here. I can change worse into better. He glared from under his brow and swiveled to the outer wall. I'll make it into whatever we want, he charged, the light flaring in his hands as he beat against the wall and screamed, sear marks left at his touch. He beat the wall until it quaked, skin blazing like frozen lightning as the air roared around him. He jabbed the leathery hide, fingers carving through it until he beat the plated scales beneath and threw himself, a catapulting star. Green flames burst from the sizzling black blood and became white over the charred, disintegrated remains of the growing cavern. They wrapped around him, flew through him and into the wall of scales until they cracked and broke and splintered into the outer darkness. Something groaned and growled, shaking the cavern and all its flesh. He smirked and smiled wickedly, pulling every drop of flame into his hands. His form solidified into something like flesh, white as salt and sculpted, but his hands were liquid fire and light and heat. Suffer.
He opened his hands, and all of him, his rage, wrath, vengeance, joy, fear, burst from his fingertips like a vomiting sun. The air caught fire and screamed. The fleshy walls and floor turned to ash. The scales trembled and shook and flew away, groaning like warped iron. He ground his teeth and shut his hands with a gasp, collapsing to one knee as the light and flame jolted back into him. He panted, heavy eyes staring through the portal as cold air slithered inside and settled, misting over the flesh and choking the flames until he was the only light. He pushed himself up with a groan, hand grabbing the edge of the portal and ignoring the growing warm light behind him. "Hurry! To me! Before she finds us out!" Muffled voices came from the charred hall behind, rising with the warm light as he set his foot on the portal and peered outside. The darkness steaming around him in a rainbow halo that burned away a half-meter from his skin. Then came the shrieking scream as the roiling hills swam over one another in broken knots. The darkness became light as the scream deepened to an inaudible rumble, and the vision twisted back into the leaping wolves, burning, hungry eyes glaring at him. "What did you see?" the doctor asked coolly. Phoebus breathed, silent tears spilling down his cheeks as his eyes flitted, retracing his steps in the vision, heart full and guts empty as the primal euphoria of the dream character flooded him. "Well?" He stared at the dark background in the painting, the muddle of bodies amongst the crows and blood-soaked earth, shifting like the darkness the longer he stared. I was the man again. The man made of light. I broke out of the prison of flesh, only I got to see it from the inside. I saw him free himself. I felt the elation, the freedom, the victory. Can you explain in more detail?" He flicked up to the camera and cleared his throat, sifting through the images as he recounted the vision, smiling wide, cursing the thing he broke free from, letting it animate his body, possess him. "And what do you think of this vision's significance?" He shrugged, eyes trailing the glint of his dying spit on the painting near the frame. "You don't think much of it, or you don't have an opinion?" I don't know what to think. It's important, I guess. It appears too often for it not to be, but I don't understand it. Or why I've dreamt it my whole life. "Well, when I asked you your earliest memory, you said it was the dream. Now, that wasn't at a very young age, 7 or so, so perhaps there's some trauma you've buried and this is how you've conjured it." The beginning of the world and the beginning of my memory, both converging, signifying the world began when I did. Narcissism, or delusions of grandeur, he said placidly, eyes never leaving the glint of his spit across the fields of the dead. "And I make myself be born, meaning I was alive before birth, metaphorically, so the start to a new life, a new me. And I was born from a serpent, who tried to keep me buried inside, who I had to fight to free myself and the others before we made the world, a new world just for us. Likely the serpent's my mother or a guardian that abused me and others, and I had to create a persona, become the one who conquered the leader, the first, the king, the shining beacon, like how I shine in the vision." "Yes, actually." "Except my mother loved me. She had albinism too and never wanted me to feel ostracized. My father was the only good man I ever knew, taught me how to work hard and fight for everything I ever got. I wasn't adopted, I wasn't traumatized, I'm not delusional. I am worth every cent I have and every loose wallet purchase I made because I earned every green cent of it by working hard until I bled, until the world hated me, only to realize it loved me after it watched me soar." The spit was dry, just leaving the dead and dying to reach out to their gods in frozen agony while the black wolves swallowed heaven. "There is one thing, though.
He quirked his eyebrows as the light and rumble flashed on and off again, mixing with the doctor's voice. "You just said you and the others built the world. You've never mentioned that before. Is that in your dream? Do you remember when you and your brother and sister made the world?" He furrowed his brow. "I didn't... No, it's not in the dream. It always ends right before the other two make it out. I don't know how I win the fight." "But you know you win the fight, and you know there are two others?" "Yeah, dream logic. I just do." "But you've seen your brother, the other man, in this dream." "I don't have a brother." "No, just now. You said you saw him. You said he glowed like sunrise. And there were other dreams too. Do you remember your brother and sister?" "I don't... I already told you." "What about your mother?" Her voice was cold as the lights flipped on, silencing the rumble. "Do you remember her? The pain you caused her?" "I never hurt my mother." "Phoebus, you always hurt your mothers. It's one of your consistent traits. You always hurt your mothers and become your own father." "What are you talking about? I never hurt my mother." "When you left, I'm sure she was hurt." His eyes flicked through the darkness as the rumble seeped into his chest. His mother's face appeared in the black, pale as the moon with reddish blonde hair, blue eyes, and sun scars. "Ma." She wept, tears of blood staining her cheeks. "You left her alone. You carved yourself out of her life to make your own." The doctor's voice came slow as the light flicked on and banished his mother's face. "Wherever you went, you left more and more of her behind." "No!" He sneered before the darkness came and brought his mother's face, eyes empty sockets as she cried empty sobs. "I always called. I sent money. I came home. Never left her alone." "Why did you go?" his mother said, clothed in darkness. Her hands reached past the cloak and settled on his. "I never see you any more, Phoebe." The light flicked on and his mother was gone. "You carved yourself free of her and that little apartment and grew wings. But they never were strong enough to carry anyone but yourself, Phoebus." "She was there when I made my first dollar. She was the only one I ever trusted." The dark and growl swallowed him, and his mother's head was curled in his lap, sobbing with empty eyes and fingers stained black. "Why did you leave me? Why?" She lifted her head and black blood oozed from the empty sockets, the gash in his skull. She smiled as he jerked back and cursed, yellowing fangs carving out of grey and bleeding gums. She tilted her head. "Do you remember the world you made?" The doctor's voice came out of her mouth. "The perfect one. The one you made with your brother and sister." She lunged and took his jaw in her cold, blackening hands, her voice echoing and rolling over itself. "The one you made from my corpse!" He clamped his eyes shut and growled. "You're not real. You're just a hallucination." "I'm real, Phoebus, and I'm not going anywhere. Those doors may be shut, but for how long? How well are they shut, Phoebus? Those doors, the doors in your dream?" The doctor's voice whispered in his ear. "The ones at the edge of the world. What were they?" "You're not real." The images flashed in his mind. Giant, arching gates, golden doors shut tight and embellished with pictures of battle and creation, the serpent and the three, pain and rebirth, a new world built atop something old. "There it is. Tell me, Phoebus. Tell me about the dream." The doctor's voice came clear and gentle as the growl left and light burned on the other side of his eyelids. "What?" He struggled against the restraints. "Don't do that, Phoebus, or I'll have you sedated again." He tugged a few more times on the leather belts and stopped, glaring at the camera. "What do you want?" "I just told you.
Tell me about the dream at the edge of the world again.
Her words rushed him.
The one with your brother and the sun. It's a beautiful image. No serpents in sight, if I can recall.
The light strobed as the rumble sunk into his chest, shook his chair, chattered his teeth. It rattled in his ears like a phantom scream as the backs of his eyes burned. The lights flashed so fast the painting seemed to move. Armored soldiers rushing one another but never reaching their enemies, the crows feasting on dead men, the dying screaming. Their voices came clear over the growl as the wolves slowly flew into the sky, jaws clamping down on the sun and moon as their ember eyes glowered down at him.
Shut up! Tell me about the dream, Phoebus.
The doctor's voice vibrated on the rumble as the wolves closed their mouths around the lights.
Shut up! Shut your mouth! Let me go!
He arched his back and screamed, wide, wild eyes glowering at the hungry mutts, fingers scraping the arms of the wheelchair. The doctor's voice came low and drawn out as the strobe came faster.
The dream with the doors. The open doors, Phoebus. Shut your mouth. Shut up. Shut up. Shut up. Shut up. Shut up. Shut up. Shut up!
He jerked and the wheelchair skidded, lilting back as the wolves sank their teeth into the lights. The strobe stopped. The back of the wheelchair hit the floor. The rumble died. Silence slithered into his ringing ears and kissed his cheek.
The dream, it said. The dream at the edge of the world with the open doors. Remind me.
Cold hands settled on his face, with dim light peeking through the fingers.
Indulge me.
The voice hissed like a crocodile, and the hands slithered away. The man from the dream stood with his back to Phoebus. Brilliant sheer white silks flowed around him as gentle wind breathed from under the brazen gates underfoot. Phoebus turned, eyeing the giant vaulted room of human stone with white marble arches at cardinal points, running into a giant ivory circle at the ceiling center, black sky beyond. A massive open archway yawned behind the sunset man, lined with gold and white marble. Opposite, the arch's twin stood, but the air was cold and unlit with something dark and deep behind the doors at its end. He swallowed and stared. Something else was there, something older, something hidden behind 100 walls and memories.
Oh, come now, you've ridden him 1,000 times, 1,000,000,
the man said to someone in front of him.
I know, but what if I veer off course?
You're not pulling a wagon, my love. You're leading the Hound of the Sun.
I know, but what if I'm not fast enough?
It was small, shy. A girl, his daughter, he realized.
Who are you? I'm Ario.
Phoebus came closer, moving around to see them both. The man's hair was spun gold woven with copper, silver, and emerald, pulled into an ornate braid down his back. His skin shone red, yellow, and white, brilliant but soft to the eye. His face was smooth and strong, a king in all but title. She was just shorter than him, and gold as an idol, with living jasper eyes and hair like polished silver. She shone like candle flame, but there was no burn, no sting, just warmth.
You are Ario, firstborn of the brother to the king of the gods, the lady of the east, the rising light, the waker of dead eyes.
The man took her hands, their lights mingling in a strange kaleidoscope of auras that played in their white silks and red and blue tunics.
I know, but...
He set a finger to her lips and smiled, pulling out a band of twined gold wire, shaped like grapevines and blooming with jasper fruit. He held it over her head, with moist eyes. And this morning I name thee Goddess of the Morning, Bringer of Dawn. He set the wreath atop her head and hugged her. She buried her face in his chest before they pulled apart with smiles and tears. She nodded.
Then I must away, eh, father? No turning back.
Certainly not, Phoebus said, and set a hand on her shoulder with a smile, ablaze in fierce white light. She smiled nervously up at him. You'll do well, Ario. But keep in mind, the sun is no tame thing. I made him myself in that heat of battle. For slaughter was he formed, and for slaughter he still yearns. Never forget the severity of your charge. You are sweet, but you are strong. She nodded with a small smile and blush. Yes, sweet one, you are strong. Be strong. And don't let your mind wander.
Yes, my king.
They parted, he and the other man, Ario's father going to the open arch and she to the dark hole. The floor shook as mechanisms whirred and the grates broke apart to slither into the walls. Something roared and snarled in the pit below as light flared and flashed, arcing hotter than lightning and hemmed by mists of rainbow. He stared down the hall after her, through the darkness. There's something there. A door at the end. A gate. It's massive, but there's something else. Buried behind walls. She'll do well, brother. You spoke well, the man said curtly, his light shining brighter, hotter. Are you displeased? Not in what you said. Well, actually, yes, in what you said. You needn't have startled her. This is the first time she'll don the crown and mount Khorasha. How many others have tried and been eaten over our heads? Calm yourself. None of the gods have tried. First of Adam, then Raksha. No god will fail as they have. You can't know that. King as you are, you're not fate. Bright as you are, you needn't heed your light so much so as to blind yourself to all but yourself. Mind your words. The other sighed and stared down the pit, light growing from beneath as the roars got closer. I tire of seeding the reins with blood. After she's risen and given charge over to Baidot, I think I'll recede to the west. You needn't leave, brother, Phoebus said from shining lips. There cannot be two kings. He stared into Phoebus's eyes, the light flaring bright as his for an instant before settling back to the gentle, persistent warmth. Besides, the east and west are the only gates which might open with the keys. Has the north finally shut its mouth, then? Knowest the king not? They smirked at each other. They've sent word, the winds. The north has shut her mouth. The key might only open our seeds now. Good. Better it be you and I to stand watch. The man nodded, fiery hands clasped over his stomach as he went to turn and stopped. Remember this, before I take my leave. One throne is lonely, but 100 seats of council won't give you the company you desire. Phoebus sighed with a frown. I would that I could deny you that truth. But truth will persist. It is written. They smiled, and the man walked the halls, others bowing to him as he went, his light warming the white marble. Gates, the doctor's voice echoed. You didn't go into that much detail last time. What gates are you talking about? Golden doors flared behind his eyes and beyond. Darkness, and snapping fangs and nameless things. I don't know. Fire crested over the edge of the pit as Ario shot up and through the open circle in the ceiling. She called high from atop a winged horse with a barbed tail, black and sapphire. Her call faded before the sun leapt up and broke through the circle, a giant, monstrous hound made of flaming tongues. His eyes glowed fierce as Phoebus, his teeth like blades of light, his claws long and sharp to grip the ether and run on air. He bounded up, roars bellowing through the eastern edge of the world, sounding like the earth had cracked in two. Phoebus's eyes drifted down the dark hole to the pale doors of pearl, marble, and jade, hemmed in Stygian iron and onyx. Cold whispers rung in his ears from beyond the doors, asking if he wished to know his future, asking if the king dared go below into the dark, asking, taunting, prodding with unfelt hands. But beyond it, down the left turn before the doors, after the winding, claustrophobic halls, there was another gate. Smaller. It's smaller, and made of gold and silver and salt. The doors. The doctor's voice echoed as if on the back of the whispers. Tell me of the doors. You didn't see them in your dream, did you? Phoebus shook his head. But you knew them. Had you seen them before and forgotten to mention? Your description's rather detailed this time. The whispers. Dead, one said. Dead 100 times, 1,000 lives do I see, flowing from you like a mighty river, each anew, yet each remembered in the end before our gates. Which whispers? Her voice came at his shoulder, chilling his skin. They want to tell me my future, that I'll die 1,000 times. Where do they come from? The gates. The pale gates. They're... I can't use those gates, only... The dead know. A new whisper voiced. We see and know. Ours is home of the timeless three, your sister's kin, your fate as well as ours. Tell us what you wish to know, a third voice whispered. Or else let us sleep, king of strange gods, for we have lived long enough to be weary of waking dreams. Let us sleep and dream eternal at our queen's bosom. Go then. The dead? The doctor asked at his shoulder. He looked, but she wasn't there. The gates to the underworld, perhaps? Strange. This dream's always puzzled me. The man you love sending his daughter to be chased by something dangerous, yet he scorns you for praising her. And the beast is the sun, and all of it takes place before the gates to hell, where you hear that you will die. No, not the east. The east isn't hell. I just know it. No? But what of the other gate? Do you remember it? Is that hell? The doctor breathed deeply, setting a cold hand on Phoebus's shoulder. It's still gold and pretty on one side, isn't it? He swallowed and turned, squinting at the place the voice should be as all the other people faded from his vision. You should see the other side. It hasn't shone in eons.
black as pitch and rusted.
He swiped a glowing hand in front of him and caught something. His skin flared like the noonday sun, light lifting off him like ripples through water. The air shimmered, shaping into the form of his mother, skin like marble, long coiled hair caught in his hand as she smiled with her perfect teeth and blue eyes.
"What do you want?"
"Well, this is new," his mother said with the doctor's voice. He slammed her against the hewn stone wall, burning hand at her throat as he towered over her. She smiled wide. "That door.
"What of it?"
Do you remember why you built it?" He squeezed her throat. She wagged a finger in his face and pouted. "Temper, temper. You must have gotten that from me." He turned and threw her across the room with a bellow and snarl before freezing, nervous eyes flitting across a new vision. It was grotto, the walls and ceiling raw stone, the table fixed to the floor decorated with a map of the world. The doors to a balcony were open, letting in frigid wind to tussle his long loose curls of light and white silk robes.
"The stupid child opened one of the gates to the underworld."
A woman slammed the red oak door shut. Her green and gold silk dress and black cloak of feathers tattered, her knightish hair loose and disheveled as she spun. Her slender, sharp face was curved into a scowl until she looked like a bird.
"What?"
Phoebus shouted, light flaring.
"Who? When?" "Hours ago. Some straggling shade."
The woman's pale face was white and solid as the marble, but her eyes were glossy onyx.
"She learned one of the Banes was close to one of my gates. She didn't know which one, so she opened the door at the bottom of the ocean."
Something pricked inside his skull, scratching to get out, but Phoebus smirked, and his light dimmed.
"It isn't funny!"
Her clawed fingers, tipped in black, curled like she might snatch him from across the room.
"One of the Titans nearly got free, and now the Kraken's been awoken and is eating ships in the Triangle."
"Is it under control?"
"Yes. Posadao is taking care of it, but the mortals
will be none the wiser." She moved around the table, an angry smirk on her face as the feathers ruffled and the cloak twitched. No, not a cloak. Wings. Something flickered in her shadow, pale with black fading up from its hands and feet, spreading from between its legs and out from eye and mouth. His mother smiled, long black coils falling around her like a veil. Then she was gone.
"Why aren't you taking this seriously?"
The woman barked as she leaned over the balcony, opening her wings to take in the wind.
"It wasn't an Adam, it was a shade. And she's on the right track."
But it wasn't the right door. She thought that it was the door to the underworld itself, so she can't be close to finding either of the Banes. "Either?" The doctor's voice echoed. "Does that mean there were two like the one you felt?" "Maybe we should stop this and intervene," the woman said, looking over her shoulder. "We've walked long enough." Phoebus gasped as the thing scratched through and a red-hot knife jabbed the base of his skull. He stumbled back, hands cradling his head as he whimpered. It built in his chest as the pain spindled around his skull, pounding to get out with each heartbeat. "Phoebus," the doctor said, repeating his name. His mother crawled out from under the woman's wings, eyeless sockets staring as she gave him a lipless smile, maggots wriggling over her grey and black flesh. She skittered on all fours as Phoebus stumbled to his knees, doubling over as his eyes rolled into his head with a broken cry. "The doors," his mother said in a deep voice like a breaking mountain. "Doors keep out and let in, hold things back. Why did you build those doors? Phoebus, He squeezed his eyes shut against the swimming light and blurry edges. She chuckled. Darkness glided in after her, covering the world beneath the balcony, the room, the woman, swallowing his eyes.
Do you remember how you hurt your mother?
The lights flashed dimly, casting the dark walls and dark wood with black shadows as the elevator dinged and the nurses appeared either side of him. They lifted him back to stare at the painting, oxygen masks firmly fixed to their faces, sounds coming and going in echoes as the edges of the world blurred together. "Next time, try not to get so violent, Phoebus. The gas can be toxic if used too much." The doctor's voice came over the intercom, stabbing into his ears as the burn pulsed from the base of his skull, worming inside. He groaned, eyes rolling back as the nurses wheeled him into the elevator and spun him back round. "Rest. We'll try another session in a few days." He stared at the painting, the wolves with the sun and moon in their jaws, smiling at him as the doors shut.
Do you remember how you